So let's go to the next slide, Bruff. So tonight, we are going to just give a very brief introduction to Resilience Hubs. We're going to hear from Dr. Kent Boyd from the Minnesota Climate Adaptation Partnership. He's going to spend the majority of our evening filling us in on his work and talking about community health and nursing and how that relates to Resilience Hub programming. We're going to have a breakout and talk a little bit about the kinds of programming that your community might need. And then we'd love to leave you with this question. Are you interested in becoming an emerging hub? I know the answer for some of you is already yes, but if you are interested, we'll talk a little bit about how you can be involved in the coming year. Next slide. All right, Buff, do you want to?
Thanks. Welcome, everybody. We're so glad you're with us. Let's acknowledge that wherever you may be, we are all on Indigenous land. Minnesota is located on the traditional and contemporary homelands of the Anishinaabe and Dakota peoples, the original stewards of this territory. We are committed to uplifting the stewards of this land and the name of these lands and the community members from these nations as we pursue a right path together. We acknowledge the trauma that's deeply embedded in the foundation of this country. The land we reside on came under control of the USA through genocide, slavery, and ongoing occupation, and we recognize the deep historical, spiritual, and personal trauma that has impacted all of us, and especially Indigenous communities, communities of color, and immigrant communities. By offering this acknowledgement of trauma, we affirm the right of people to bring their whole selves and stories into this space, and we affirm our intention to promote healing, respect, and love. Thank you all for joining me in that.
Thanks so much, Buff. I want to especially recognize that there are neighbors among us in our state that are afraid to leave their homes right now, and things are not well. I think that one of the hazards of talking about resilience hubs by talking about blue sky days and sort of days of great emergency is that we fail to recognize that there are emergencies happening every day to people in our communities. So I start every CCRN webinar with this picture of this boat, this fair boat, and it's traveling through some fairly rough waters. And the question is, how do we prepare for those rough waters? How do we make it possible for us to carry our, metaphorical glasses across the deck of the ship and not spill the water? And in order to do that, we have to build the handholds. We have to be thinking about the kinds of structures that we can create to make sure that we can sail that ship in whatever waters we encounter. Next slide. You'll see this again in Dr. Boyd's presentation, but I wanted to just remind you that we are using a definition of a resilience hub that comes from the Urban Sustainability Directors Network. And it talks about, how we create places that during everyday times, during a disruption, and during recovery, have the ability for us to be planful and responsive to the needs and the values and the visions of the people that we live among. So we spend time during this webinar series talking about creating programs and services that are going to be offered all the time, but maybe are particularly ready to respond during an emergency. We like to think about the communications that are needed, the ways that we get to know each other, the newsletters, the door knocking, the one-to-one communication, the one-on-ones that we do. How do we communicate? What are the operations that we use? Who unlocks the building? who is able to help us set up what we need in order to be powerful and productive and safe in the context of whatever we're encountering. How do we set up our buildings in a way and the landscapes around them in a way that serves our vision in our community? And how do we power these buildings? Next slide. We have also been on this journey together and thinking about steps that it takes to create a community resilience hub. So this comes from Susan Silber from a group in California that has been working on resilience hub planning. And so they talk about all the kinds of work that we need to put into building the community plan that is going to take us forward. So it's not just that you snap your fingers and you've got what you need. There's all kinds of work that goes into visioning and goal setting and implementing the kinds of places that we want to create. Next slide. Okay, so with that, I just want to welcome Dr. Kent Boyd. I first got to know Kent, gosh, maybe almost at least 8 years ago, maybe even close to 10 years ago. He was in a PhD program. He has a doctorate of nursing practices. Did I say that correct?
Correct. Yep.
Excellent. Kent started out with a master's in nursing. He has, deep experience as, in nursing, but he decided in his PhD program to turn his attention to what is going to not just help people when they are very ill or very hurt, but to help create the kinds of systems that will keep us healthy in the first place. So he worked with one of my heroes, which is Dr. Teddy Potter at the University of Minnesota. Teddy Potter was one of the very first people on the Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light board who created the movement development team. She said, you can't create an organization just by, getting grants and doing the things. You've got to have a vision, and you've got to build the community that's going to bring that vision to life together. And so she created this team called the Movement Development Team. At the same time, she was over at the university creating a program on planetary health. And I know that Kent, you and some of your colleagues have been the folks who have moved that program into certification. And there are nurses all across the world who are now being certified in planetary health, who have an awareness of what's to come in terms of what's on the landscape regarding climate change, but also all the other planetary challenges that we have in front of us. So thanks for doing that work, and thanks for sharing some of your knowledge with us. And I think I'm going to hand it to you so that you can share your slides and let people know what you've got in your brain when it comes to building community-based resilience hubs.
There is a lot there. So, in a short amount of time, I've already been warned that I have too many slides, but we'll roll with it.
Oh, and
Thank you.
Kent, make sure you tell them what you're doing now. I didn't
I
talk
will.
about the climate adaptation partnership.
It's one of the many slides, so we're good.
Beautiful.
Thank you, Julia, for that introduction. Thank you all for having me. Thank you, MNIPL, for having me. This is the first of many, I'm sure, collaborations and everything. I mean, we're already collaborating behind the scenes, but with all of you, hopefully one of many, and I very much look forward to it. Before I close everyone out of my screen, can you all see the slide? And I'll put it in the
We
Yes.
slideshow
can see the slide.
view.
Yep.
Cool, great. Okay. So, as Julia mentioned, my name is Dr. Kent Boyd. I am a doctor of nursing practice, a registered nurse by training, and I currently work with the University of Minnesota in the Climate Adaptation Partnership. And so that's part of the University of Minnesota Extension program or department, which is your 4-H, your Master Gardeners, your Master Naturalists, those sorts of programs also live in Extension. We are a program within Extension that focuses on climate adaptation, resilience, preparing Minnesotans for the observed changes and the projected changes related to climate change, and not only preparing but creating healthy communities in the process. Um, at MCAP, that's the abbreviation for it. I am the Climate Adaptation, Resilience, and Public Health Extension Educator, which is a very long title. Um, so you don't need to remember that, but that's my role there. MCAP is unique. So, like I said, it's an extension program, but it also lives with one foot in the College for Food, Agriculture, and Natural Sciences, which allows us to do both of the research and have our specialist, who is Dr. Heidi Roop, and our director. We have about 5 members on our research team, all helping us in our various areas of expertise, while also developing climate models for Minnesotans, for the state, so that we can prepare for those changes and not use global models, which are they have a wider range or area that they focus their models on, and we don't need to go into that. And then we have the extension side, which is that community programming piece. So we go out into the community and we help to bring the research and knowledge from the university into these communities. So we're really unique in that. Um, as I mentioned, we have sector-specific expertise on the team. So we have 5 different extension educators with varying backgrounds, one in agriculture, one in tribal food systems, myself in human health. We have a water/forestry person, kind of bridging the gap there. And then we have someone who's working specifically in the Arrowhead region with state or with community, local, and indigenous leaders to help plan for the changing climate in those areas. And so that's part of a larger project there. Um, so we have this multidisciplinary team, and trying to shift that into a transdisciplinary team where we create a similar shared language amongst all these different disciplines. And so that's kind of one of the beauties of MCAP, is that we have all that expertise. Some of what we do across the state in regard to both the research and bringing that to fruition, and then also the extension education. We have our MinClimate tool, which is a high resolution climate projection tool, which I'll talk about briefly later. We have, as part of our team, is actually gathering ice core samples from Antarctica to show that historically the different ebbs and flows of climate change, and what we're experiencing now is beyond what we've seen historically, and how that attributes to human-induced causes. We've worked with different state agencies to update the state's climate action plans and, excuse me, frameworks. We're out in the community, we're doing extension programs, and we're across the state. So that's just a bit of what we do as a team. And what I've been working on more in my role are 3 projects that are leading to larger programs for all of Minnesotans. One of them is the Clean Air for All project, which is focused in North Minneapolis and bringing air particle sensors into the community for hyper-local data, educating community members and youth specifically on what the data means and how to interpret it and what it means in relation to their story. So their health stories, what they've experienced, what they see in the day to day, all those sorts of things. They can now have the data to back that up, or to not to well to tell that story further, and then they can take that and start to advocate, whether at the policy level, for changes in their community with that data, with their stories, bringing this whole picture approach to that. Um, the other piece, which is or the other project that I'll reference, that's of relevance to all of you, is the co-creating community climate resilience hubs. So we were tasked with developing resilience hubs across 12 different neighborhoods in the Twin Cities. So those are highlighted here, and we've taken those neighborhoods. I ran a vulnerability assessment on those down to the census level across multiple different factors and variables, and identified um, key neighborhoods and census tracts within those neighborhoods that were more vulnerable than the others, and started looking at those in community-based organizations within those areas to develop resilience hubs. Um, One of the things that we found early on, which is one of the benefits of what MNIPL is doing, going out into the community and saying who is interested, is that coming from our perspective, we did the vulnerability assessment and then started to reach out to different community-based organizations in the areas. And that's a really hard relationship to try to form. instead of inviting people into the conversation, we did a different way. And what we found though is that there are those folks that are interested, and sometimes they were in the least vulnerable of the 12 neighborhoods. But that's okay because they're still among the most vulnerable, and they still have populations within them that are more vulnerable than others. And in this vision, similar to what MNIPL has, maybe not as uh, extravagant as 10,000 resilience hubs across Minnesota, but we want resilience hubs across Minnesota. And so we envision networks, even within neighborhoods, of these different hubs and connections, and not one hub can do all things. And so, what are the different connections? But also going where there's interest. And so, all of you are expressing interest, and so MNIPL is doing great to continue to foster that movement behind that, and that's something that we also saw as go kind of where the wind takes you, and it may not be the most vulnerable, but that's okay in the moment. Um, I know this is the last of the year's CCRN talks, so you're well familiar with resilience hubs, with the basics. We won't go too much into detail there, but I just wanted to make sure we're all on the same page that resilience hubs are safe, frequented, inclusive, centralized facilities. These can be community centers, faith-based facilities, libraries, clinics, schools, etc. They're designed with the community. And so it's not the local government coming in and say, we want a resilience hub. We're going to put it here. This is what it's going to do. We're going to base it on emergency preparedness that we have to abide by from the federal level. It's what does the community want? And are there connections with these local government units that we can pair with and make sure that we're functioning to serve them as well, but really answering to the community first and foremost. They're inter and multi-generational spaces. They address the vulnerabilities and needs of the community while also promoting the strengths. So it's not just this deficit model, but it's also a strength and adaptive capacity model. Operates in those three phases, as Julia had mentioned, has the five categories, which Julia had mentioned, and then has flexibility, adaptability, modality in the design of the spaces. Can it function in multiple different ways? The utilities or equipment that it has within it. When we're talking about vulnerability assessments for the neighborhoods or the communities that we're interested in, this comes back to ecological principles, looking at exposure, so the hazard, the sensitivities of the community or the ecosystem that we're concerned for. So is it what makes it more susceptible to those hazards? And that's the potential impact, that's the negative, that's what we're trying to address. But then also looking at those adaptive capacities, those positive factors, those strengths within the community that we can leverage and continue to build upon. And then both of those things equal our vulnerability, but that's really where we're targeting our efforts is on those two things, minimizing the potential impacts and strengthening those adaptive capacity factors. When we look at the federal disaster recovery continuum, a lot of effort, and you may have seen this in other speakers or other literature reviews of resilience hubs. There's a lot of focus in the response and then the recovery and rebuilding, right? And that makes sense if we think about resilience true to its definition. It's a return back to baseline. And if we're focusing on a resilience hub, it's minimizing the time it takes to get back to baseline. What we find, though, when we're actually out in these communities, and again, talking about vulnerabilities, is that baseline may not be good. It may not be worth returning to. And so, how do we, during those times of normalcy, build up and allow people to thrive and exceed beyond their baseline, create new baselines so that not only are we decreasing our vulnerabilities for those disasters and disruptions, but also what we return to is better than what we started at. And so that's where I find a lot of promise of resilience hubs and potentials of resilience hubs, especially as a health professional and a public health professional, is these spaces that are already those safe, frequented, trusted, centralized spaces that people go to, how can we bolster what they're doing and start to address the other things, social determinants of health? I saw that in the chat. I have a slide on that later. Other pieces of health that can really promote the community health so that these events, whether they're true federally recognized disruptions or the minor, quote unquote minor, because to the communities they're not minor, disruptions and disasters that we face every day, and that a resilience hub can serve their community for. So, although we focus on disruption and recovery often, I posit that we need to focus much more on the normal steady state blue sky days, whether that's through programming, through connection, through networking, through addressing those upstream issues that are faced in the community. And an example of how this can look, if we're taking Teddy Potter's visioning idea, my vision comes from Cuba. I had the privilege of traveling to Cuba in 2023 and learned a lot about their healthcare system and about their preparedness, disaster preparedness system. Um, Essentially, everything, all of their different systems relate back to health, to public health, because they don't, because of the embargo, they don't have the resources to react to these things. They have to prevent them from happening. So what, you can't prevent the natural disasters. You can't, you can mitigate climate change, but we're still going to experience some climate change because of what we've already done. So we can't necessarily stop all of that, but we can prevent how it impacts communities. All that to say that in 2022, Hurricane Ian made its way through Cuba first and then through Florida and kind of trailed its way up the similar path that hurricanes tend to take along the East Coast. So when it hit Western Cuba, it was a Category 3 storm. They had two direct deaths from this. They had five total. Three of them were related to the electrical repairs after the storm, so not related to the storm itself. After the storm had gone through, they had a national power outage affecting 12 million people. And that was for at least a week they had that outage. Okay. That same storm made its landfall in western Florida as a Category 4 storm. In Florida, there were 150 direct and indirect deaths. It caused $113 billion in damages. And then as it traveled along the coast, obviously decreasing its category of storm, there were additionally five deaths in North Carolina and one in Virginia. So that same storm, as it decreased in severity going up the East Coast, killed about as many people or caused as many deaths as it did going through Cuba as a Category 3 storm, going through the most populous part of Cuba. But that's because they're focused on prevention. Everyone in Cuba knows what to do when there are these storms. In the US, we talk about it, we warn people, but there isn't that sense of, there's almost this sense of oh, what am I there? I can't remember the word that I'm thinking of, but that it's not going to impact me. And we're seeing that even out in the West Coast right now with the flooding, where people are told to evacuate and they're choosing not to. There's this sense of protection there, or that someone will save me afterwards. We're in that reactionary mindset. Um, so that's kind of the brief of resilience hubs as I see them, a bit of behind the work, but really the perspective that I bring is this intersection of climate, health, and disaster preparedness, and I really challenge that preparedness piece with the prevention. Um, but what we see is that climate change is going to impact us in a multitude of ways. We likely know this already. If we don't, here are some examples as it relates to human health. And the reason that I also like to share this, well, two reasons. One is that it includes mental health impacts, which, if any of you are health professionals or familiar with with the inner workings of healthcare and everything else, mental health seems to come in last, always. It seems to be an afterthought added later. And unfortunately, that's the same case for this diagram, but it's there now. And it's also all-encompassing that any one of these hazards has a potential to impact mental health. And so I really like this diagram for that reason. The other is that if we're talking about true disaster preparedness, there's only really two uh, categories on here that are recognized as disasters by the federal government. And so would be severe weather and flooding, which has its own thresholds, and then wildfires and smoke. Extreme heat isn't recognized as a disaster. Drought, environmental degradation, all those other things aren't recognized either. Drought actually may be, I'd have to look into that, but increased allergy. So the impacts are more broadly impacting communities than even the federal government recognizes, which then translates or trickles down to the state government's recognition and local government recognition. So we need to be prepared for all of this, kind of regardless of what the federal government is doing. Um, the American Public Health Association took some of so took four of the main hazards, rising temperatures, extreme weather, air quality, and vector-borne diseases, and started to map out how this impacts different systems. And so that it's not just these are directly impacting health, but they're moving through different pathways and sometimes overlapping with other pathways that ultimately lead to health effects, but have secondary effects, impact the environment, and all of those things lead to more of a planetary health perspective, which we'll also touch on later. But so I like this diagram because it starts to show the pathways between these hazards before it gets to human health. Similarly, the World Health Organization took this when looking at extreme heat and differentiated direct impacts on human health versus indirect impacts. And I like this as well because it has that more robust impacts on human health. So with direct impacts, we can see heat illness, dehydration, heat cramps, heat stroke, um, accelerated death, so exacerbation of existing pre-existing conditions, and then also impacting humans directly, regardless of existing diseases or conditions. Looking at indirect impacts, we have increased ambulance callouts, slower response times, overburdened emergency departments. So if you think about our rural communities, which may be farther removed or have be in inaccessible spots to reach their local clinics, if it's an extreme heat day in these areas that aren't prepared or used to extreme heat or heat events even, because extreme heat has its own threshold. Um, are they prepared to manage that on their own while they're waiting for the ambulance or waiting for EMS or someone to come out and help? And if we're talking about heat stroke, which is one of those direct impacts, you have 15 minutes if someone's suffering from heat stroke before if you don't start to manage that and cool that person's core body temperature down, you have 15 minutes until that leads to organ failure. So if they're already having a 2 hour trip for an ambulance to get to you because of where you're located, um, what does that look like? And so how do resilience hubs kind of play into that as well, whether it's the education piece or a place to go, a cooling center, communications, what have you. Um, Anyways, I digress on that, but that's just, it's something of urgency and importance for me. Um, some of the other things that have indirect impacts, the storage of medications, also the efficacy of medications, and the way that we perceive heat specifically in this example. Medications can be impacted in one of those three ways or multitudes of those ways. Increased risks of accidents. So as we're trying to cool off, that could lead to drowning. It could really lead to work-related accidents, injuries, and poisonings as we're not thinking properly or we're confused because of the way that heat is impacting us. Increased transmission of diseases and infectious diseases, and then potential disruptions of our local infrastructure. That could be power, water, transport, and also productivity. We're less productive in those hotter environments if we're not acclimated to the weather that we're working in. Climate change is also costly. So I mentioned in that example of Hurricane Ian, it was $118 billion. NOAA has been tracking billion-dollar weather and climate disasters since the 1980s. And in 2024, we had 27 separate billion-dollar weather and climate disasters that impacted the United States. And that totaled $182 billion nationally. That doesn't factor in healthcare costs. I believe it doesn't factor in insurance policy changes and things like that. Um, and then since they've been recording the billion-dollar disasters from 1980, so from 1980 to 2024, it's cost the U.S. $2.9 trillion in uh, in repairing the damage or in damages from climate and weather related disasters. So this is costly. It's not just related to our health; it's also our quality of health, quality of life, our well-being, and the economics of and finances of our nation. This gets into a bit of social determinants of health. So we have those direct impacts on health. We'll talk a bit more about some of those. But it's also the quality of life, the well-being of folks, as well as those impacts on health. And so we kind of quantify those as, or qualify those as social determinants of health. It's the interactions that people have with their environments on a daily basis that shape their overall health and well-being. Um, some considerations there are education, accessibility, stability, economic and financial stability, connection, whether that's neighborhood or familial, communal, and then the surrounding and built environments. All of these play a part in our health as humans. And I just wanted to point out that one of the goals from Healthy People 2030 was is to create social, physical, and economic environments that promote attaining the full potential for health and well-being for all. And I think a goal of a resilience hub should also be that, not just returning to that baseline, but really attaining that full potential of health for the community. As we look at some of the ways in which climate change impacts health, so looking at that diagram, diving a bit deeper into some of those hazards, we see emerging infectious diseases. We see that the habitat and life cycle of our ticks and mosquitoes in Minnesota are increasing. So the habitat for ticks and mosquitoes, well, for ticks certainly, are expanding northward and westward. They're projected to reach Alaska. The black-legged tick, which is the carrier of Lyme disease, is expected to have a suitable habitat in Alaska by 2050. And then mosquitoes, which typically for our West Nile virus in the state is along the western border, we're seeing an increase in life cycle as well as an increase in the habitat there, going more into the Dakotas and again northward into Canada. As we think about just managing human development, there's a potential for more human-animal interactions. We can also look at this from migration patterns as animals adapt their migratory patterns to climate change. We have potential more interactions with animals, which can lead to the transition of infectious diseases between these species. Uh, Fungal and aquatic diseases and changing climates, thinking about harmful algal blooms, also looking at forced migration and displaced populations. This may not be something that we necessarily see in Minnesota, but think about globally and how Minnesota is a place of refuge for other countries, for other populations. And so, what does that look like, and how do we prepare for that um, uh, in the near future? Um, When we're looking at extreme heat, like I said, there are medication interactions. So two that I pulled out here, but there are many. Mental health medications often interrupt our perception of extreme heat or of heat events, and they also can have implications on our thermal regulation patterns. So our body isn't able to adapt to the heat as well as it would otherwise. Cardiovascular medications are similar in that it can either be a thermal regulation impact or effect, or it can be a perception to heat events. So those are populations that we need to be considerate of, those that have medication like that. And then we know that extreme heat can exacerbate pre-existing conditions, respiratory diseases, cardiovascular diseases, um, endocrine diseases or diabetes, thyroid and kidney diseases as well. So we have the exacerbation of all of those different conditions. the heat illnesses directly. And then one other piece that I wanted to point out is that with heat events, we see an increased risk of violence. So it's not just the impact on an individual directly, but also what is that safety in the household, or in their environment or their community. With smoke and air pollution, similarly, we see an exacerbation of pre-existing conditions, respiratory and cardiovascular diseases. We also see a cause of these diseases because of smoke and air pollution, and more research is pointing to that even short exposure to air pollution can lead to some of these, to the development of some of these conditions. A lot of air pollutants are carcinogenic, and then they also have the way that our body responds to air pollution is an inflammatory response. And so, again, depending on the duration of exposure, that can actually lead to autoimmune disorders, both exacerbating and causing. It's why our lungs flare up, and why we have exacerbations of asthma attacks and other respiratory diseases. And it can actually impact our integumentary system, so our skin, and lead to different disorders there as well. And then with flooding, I didn't give it enough space on this, but one of the concerns that we have is the introduction of waterborne diseases. Legionella uh, is one of them that we've seen recently. And so this is both because of flooding and then the afterwards, the cleanup, the mold development, infectious diseases and waterborne diseases that way, or fungal diseases. And then damages of flooding is also important to consider. Um, we also need to be aware of food and water safety. 70% of water pollution comes from nitrogen runoff, followed by heavy rain events. Um, and the way that we uh, um, care for our land. So whether this is agriculture or residential, nitrogen use and fertilizer, being aware of that could impact our water consumption. Even though we're the land of 10,000 lakes, there are concerns of what climate change will do, and also being maybe a source of water distribution for surrounding states that aren't as blessed with natural water systems. And then nutritional density, if we're thinking of our food systems, there have been research that shows that higher greenhouse gas emission concentrations actually decrease the nutrients in staple crops. So particularly looking at zinc, iron, and protein. So not only is there potential for the conditions of climate change to alter our agricultural practices, and heavier rain events followed by drought and frequent transitions between the two, but also decreasing the nutrient density of our foods that we grow. And then lastly, mental health, looking at climate anxiety and grief. There was a study, and I don't want to get too much into studies, but there was a study by Hickman et al. In 2022 who surveyed 10,000 youth across the or worldwide. And of those 10,000, about 80% said that they were worried or very worried and suffered from climate anxiety. So very worried or very worried about climate change and suffered from some sort of climate anxiety multiple days out of the week. So this is a growing problem, and it's affecting multiple generations, but especially our youth. We also know that those that are living with untreated trauma aren't able to grasp complex ideas and thought. And so one of those being climate change, because they're in this protective mindset, they can't take the actions to better themselves or to really understand and grasp what's going on because of climate change. We also see that multiple impacts in untreated mental health, it makes it harder to recover from disruptions. And so those communities that are dealing with or suffering from untreated trauma, and it doesn't have to be weather related or disaster related trauma, um, could be uh, systemic issues, or what's going on in the home, the household. Um, that accumulates. That doesn't just go away after every disruption or disorder. I feel like I've talked a lot already, and we're just scratching the surface, but I'm going to keep rolling here. Um, so we also know that climate change doesn't impact folks equally. And so one of the ways that we see that this is an example of a heat event. It's not an extreme heat event. It was a 90-degree. So the map on the left is a 90-degree day in the Twin Cities in July of 2016. What it's depicting is the land surface temperature. So the air temperature read that it was a 90-degree day. The land surface temperature varied depending on the built environment, anywhere from 74 degrees, so 15 degrees cooler, 20 to 15 degrees cooler, to 100 to 125 degrees, especially in that downtown area. And that's because of the built environment and the absorptive properties of the built environment that slow and the lack of green space in those areas. So a 90 degree day, even though we talk about climate change, we talk about we're going to see an increase in 90 degree days, doesn't mean a 90-degree day for everybody. That depends on a multitude of factors, both individual and community and built environment and all the things that we're focusing on with our resilience hubs. Um, if we overlap this same map on the left with this on the right, the one on the right shows the state percentiles of people of color, and I did it in the same area. So we can see that those same areas that experience the 100-degree to 125-degree land surface temperatures also are the areas in the state with the highest percentages or percentile of people of color. And unfortunately, this is also by design. Because of systemic oppression, systemic racism, redlining, things like that. These communities live in areas with less green space, closer to traffic and transportation and highways, and also industry. And they typically are areas of lower socioeconomic status as well, so they can't make the investments in their own households and well-being to escape these weather-related and climate-related hazards. When we look at air quality in Minnesota, what we see is that we're starting to see an increase in the AQI alerts, and especially looking at the level or category of alerts that we're experiencing, including in 2025, which isn't listed on this graph, but Minnesota had its first hazardous rating. You may have all remembered that. I believe it was June 20th is when that was. That was also when Minneapolis and Grand Portage were the second most polluted city in the world. Um, so we're seeing a trend in this, and later we'll see that the source of these air quality alerts is also changing. What we see across the state is that low-income people and BIPOC people, including BIPOC people, already live in areas where they're likely to live, that they're likely exposed to air pollution over risk guidelines compared to the state average. So factoring in that with, we're seeing an uptick in air quality alerts and the sources. It's also this cumulative impacts piece. Uh, Other areas that we look at when we think of inequalities in climate change. So we talked about pollution, the technology deficits with rural communities and the lack of access to broadband and other technologies puts them behind in education, in decision making, and full participation in their economies. Um, we talked a bit about like the barriers to energy efficient housing and improvements. Those with lower incomes and those that are renters don't have the ability to make those changes necessarily, and they're reliant on their landlords or on policy and building codes to enforce those changes. And then access to resources. One of the beauties of Minnesota is that we live in a state that allows us to recreate outdoors frequently, but that is changing, both because of the air quality at heat events, Lyme disease, and vector-borne disease habitat increasing, but also thinking about our indigenous populations that rely on these quote unquote resources are not resources to them. They are ancestors and beings within their community. Um, as these, as the natural environment and these ecosystems start to adapt to climate change, that these indigenous populations can't necessarily adapt with them or migrate with them because of treated land and reservation areas. So that's another thing to consider, aside from also just losing their way of life. We also see vulnerable populations being pregnant people, children under 18, again, depending on the hazard that you're looking at, the elderly, outdoor workers, low socioeconomic status, BIPOC populations, both rural and urban populations. I know a lot of my work right now is in the Twin Cities, even though we want to expand it statewide. That's where we have the funding, but it's not just an urban issue, it's also a rural issue, and we see a higher emergency department visits during heat events in rural populations. We also see them in middle-aged men, which would be which is a bit of a phenomenon there. And then those with pre-existing conditions. And the map on the right is the areas identified by MPCA um, across the state. So again, I think even though they're only looking at three factors, exemplifying that this isn't just an urban issue, this is a Minnesota issue. It's not just a Minnesota issue, it's a national issue, and it's not just a national issue, it's a global issue. Um, you may be thinking that's great, but why, we see the impacts that climate change has on health, but what are we really seeing in Minnesota and why should we be worried about this in Minnesota? We have been having a decent winter so far with snowfall and things like that. Well, when we look at observed changes, we see that Minnesota is already warming. So since 1895, Minnesota has warmed about 3 degrees Fahrenheit on average. We see that northern Minnesota is warming faster than southern Minnesota, and that our winters are actually warming faster than our summers and other seasons. So this is what we're already experiencing. Not only is Minnesota getting warmer, it's also getting wetter. So the 10 wettest and warmest years on record in Minnesota have all occurred after 1997. In our heaviest rainfall events, we see 13% more precipitation in those events than we had previously. And our growing seasons have already lengthened about 2 weeks since 1950. As I mentioned, we're seeing a shift in air quality alerts and the source of air quality alerts. So from 2012 and prior, most of the air quality alerts were related to ozone. Since 2012, we've seen an uptick in wildfire smoke and also an increase in air quality alerts generally. When we're looking at projected changes, we're expecting more of the same. And so mainly looking at heat or warming and precipitation. These maps here show the days per year warmer than 90 degree Fahrenheit. So we have our historical simulation on the left, our mid-century simulations or projections in the middle, and on the right under two different scenarios. And so those scenarios just look at how much greenhouse gas concentration there is in the atmosphere that we pollute or emit into the atmosphere. Um, and so when we're looking at this, I mean, I think it's concerning just in general to see the differences from historical to mid-century, regardless of the scenario that we're looking at. But I also look at if we're looking at the high emission scenario, looking at northern Minnesota, especially along the the Arrowhead region there, and think about that's lake country, that's cabin areas, and that's older homes that probably don't have air conditioning, that don't, or if they do, it's a window unit, right? Like they don't have the necessary uh, um, structures in place to be prepared for these events. And so, how do we focus on these communities through education, through getting them the resources, implementing them, and then also having safe spaces for them to go to if they can't afford it, or if yeah. So those are kind of the areas that stick out to me of being of great concern. When we look at precipitation, we see again the fluctuations between heavy precipitation or more precipitation than we would otherwise, and the drier season. So our summers are projected to get drier. Autumn depends on where you live, kind of a mix of both, but our spring and winters are expected to get wetter. Winter is interesting because our winters are warming. They're warming the fastest. I don't have the map, but um, our by under the same scenario, mid-century, very high emission scenario, um, we're expected to lose about 27 days of winter. So it's measured in days below 32 degrees. So we lose 27 days or more below 32 degrees in our winter season. So if we think about that with an increase in precipitation, that's not the nice snow that we have outside, although it's getting warm and kind of gross right now. That's the sleety stuff that we may see tomorrow, that can also freeze over. And we think about falls, we think about car accidents and things like that. That's a real concern, even though we can't say specifically the weather is going to be this in at mid-century at this time, the likelihood is higher that it's going to be that gross sleet, freeze, uh, sleety, frozen mix of precipitation. All right, we're on the home stretch. Potential solutions. This, again, going back to the potential of resilience hubs. We talked a lot about the direct health impacts. Healthcare in itself has its own issues, but we focus a lot on the individual for behavior change. If we're looking at McElroy et al. In 1988, they described that that's it's great. Like we shouldn't not focus on that, but it's one with a limited population health impact. You're changing one person's behavior. You're also relying on that person to make those behavior changes. It's a lot of work for little reward, and we can see kind of how that grows based on the sector or the influence that we're focusing on. And second to greatest potential health impact is the community. And then institutions, organizations just below that. And I think this is where resilience hubs can really come in to be both bi-directional in that. So if we think of resilience hubs as that institution or organization, how does that impact the community? What sorts of solutions can we implement into the community? And then going above and changing policy and systems while also working on those individual and interpersonal strategies. So having that bi-directional approach is where I think the sweet spot of resilience hubs is. It's not just this reactionary feeding back into the system, but how do we start to change that, transform that system? One of the ways we do this is through renewable energy. This is one of the areas where, renewable and sustainable energy, keeping the lights on during disaster and disruption. This is a primary focus of a lot of resilience hub work, which is great, but it's only a fraction of the picture. This image here shows microgrids, which is a different take on that, and it may be more beneficial because you have multiple players in a grid of sustainable energy that contribute to the community, and so you have true to its name a microgrid of sustainable energy. So that's one potential area, but also looking at that source of communication, right? Can a resilience hub be a place with action plans, but then also acting on those plans, sending out warning to their community, to those people that frequent or that are vulnerable to the different hazards, have those emergency preparedness plans, but that also extend into the community. And in the way that I think about this is the training. If we think about even our current emergency preparedness and emergency management strategies, a lot of that lives with a health department or an emergency planning department where there are a select few people and maybe your first responders who have the training of what to do in case of an emergency, but that doesn't necessarily extend into the community. How do we get the community on board so that they are also well versed in this and it doesn't have to get to the point where we're waiting on others to respond for us? We can do that and really help alleviate the impact and damage of these disruptions. Um, and then promoting the individual utilization of monitoring. And so I have two examples here. One is the OSHA NIOSH heat safety tool on the bottom there, and that shows the heat index of the day. So that's locates to your zip code, and it tells you how not only how hot the air temperature is, but what it feels like outside with humidity in consideration as well. And then airnow.gov, which is through EPA, and that shows again zip code level data of what the air quality is in your area. And so you can make decisions based on that if you don't have access to a particle sensor, which many of us don't. Looking at heat adaptation as a hazard and specifics, uh, two of the biggest things are cooling through shade. We saw in that map of the Twin Cities that those areas with green environments or green spaces actually saw a reduction in temperature, land surface temperature up to 25 degrees. And then also if people are experiencing heat illnesses, the first thing you should do is move them to a cool space. So whether that's a natural environment or built shade, and then if they're suffering from heat stroke, like I said, you have 15 minutes to get them into to start cooling down their core body temperatures. Also looking at different ways of cooling. So those can be ice packs, those can be immersion tubs where you put the person into a tub of cool water to try to bring that core temperature down. Those are two of the most preferred and gold standard for the immersion tub for certain strategies for cooling down people in heat events. Looking at the built environment and the sorts of materials that we're using, looking at our energy usage, and then the act of being a cooling center and what does that mean in both place to cool down, but also education, a place for first aid. Hydration is also important, as you can imagine, and the education and training there. When we look at air pollution, one of the things that we've been working on with the projects is this image on the right here. It's called a Corsi Rosenthal box, but it's a do-it-yourself air purifier. So this box here is made up of four air filters that are rated higher, so MERV 13 or plus, which just means they can filter more air particles. Um, so you have four of those, a box fan on top, and then the bottom is just closed off with cardboard. In this system or equipment is about $75 currently. It's four times as effective as your commercial air purifiers. If you were to buy the equivalent in terms of the efficacy and the space that this can work for, this would be a six to $800 commercial air purifier for $75. So this is one of the strategies that we're doing to get these into these community spaces, but also into the homes of individuals, so that they don't have to go to the Resilience Hub, but they're safe within their own homes. And also thinking about what does disaster and disruption mean, even for a Resilience Hub? Like when are they operating? Maybe it's not on that moderate day, or um, indoor air pollution can be 2 to 5 times worse than outdoor air pollution just because of the different cleaners and combustion appliances that we have in our homes. And so it may not be a disaster, but the community and individuals will benefit from clean air, obviously. Um, uh, Looking at weatherization of homes, of resilience hubs, of different spaces, implementing air quality sensors so that you can so you can gather hyperlocal data for decision making and empowerment. Um, and then flood adaptation. So one of the strategies here is elevating those essential services. So your power, your HVAC, your kitchens, and your shelter areas. A way to prevent, or at least to attempt to prevent flooding, is looking at the permeability of your surrounding structures. So working with permeable pavers, exploring different options like flood vents, depending on the structure of your basement. water diversion tools, so bioswales and natural vegetation, green roofs, cisterns and rain bales, um, and then on-site water filtration as well as we think about the contamination following a flood event. Uh, if Julia hasn't mentioned this already, I'm sure she will, in looking at transportation and accessibility of resilience hubs as kind of this sixth uh, um, area of focus for resilience hubs. And the reason I highlight this, other than showing the benefit of using different modes of transportation to get people to a place, um, is also that in 2022 there was a systematic review of the resilience hub literature and found that there were, I think, two mentions of transportation in resilience hub planning and operations in that, which is probably why it's being added in some efforts as the sixth area focus area. But it's something that we need to be considering how are people getting to our spaces and what's the best way for them to do that that could also be preventative of disasters, disruptions, promote health, whether that's through active transportation or decreasing carbon emissions through public transportation and things like that, or even carpooling as a third option. And then looking at individual strategies, so some of those things that you can start to promote in your education to community members, plant-based diets, beneficial both for individual health but also for the environment. Um, Buying local, keeping a local economy revitalized or thriving, recycling and composting. 33% of all greenhouse gas emissions come from food waste, and 33% of all food is wasted. Um, Preventative health and vaccination, so looking at putting the effort into that screening, into vaccinations, into eliminating people getting sick in the first place, which then leads to the exacerbation from climate impacts and overburdening health systems and things like that. Um, Mindfulness and spirituality. I think this is a very pertinent space for faith-based facilities to play a role in not only their faith communities, but also connecting to the environment and that spirituality piece of connection with one another, connection with all living beings. I see that as a good space and a needed space in this movement. And then finally, advocacy and empowering of our communities. Okay, I'm going to move along. These are some of the example services that I had cultivated over the years of just different ways in which resilience hubs can offer and address some of those preventative strategies and needs before things get to so that you can start to address those social determinants of health before things get to the response and recovery phases. Um, if we're looking at resilience hubs and this diagram that's provided by the Urban Sustainable Directors Network, you can see the different ways in which they've incorporated different strategies for their rendition of a resilience hub. Um, I don't know if this is what they meant here, where I have this question mark, but this is what I like to think or what I like to discuss, is that that's the social connection piece. And so even before COVID, we were seeing trends that were describing decreases in social connection across the United States. 50% of Americans feel lonely. We see that these feelings of isolations have increased risks of other health conditions. So 29% increased risk for heart disease, 32% increased risk of stroke. We also know that strong social networks can positively alter the trajectory of disaster response and recovery. And so, I mean, I know like community-based organizations are already pretty good at this, but really honing in on that social connection piece and making sure people know one another, know uh, what the needs are of the community and the strengths of each of the individual players and the other organizations within the network to make this larger response system and community within that. And an example I like to share of resilience hubs or resilience network that's working towards this is Vibrant Hawaii, which is on the Big Island of Hawaii, and they do exactly that. So they work. Each one of these hearts and leaves are different resilience hubs that focus on different aspects of community resilience, and they're all connected with one another and all share resources with one another. This allows them not only to meet the demands of the community and address those needs, but also to have this collaborative response in times of disruption and to have um, um, a larger understanding or broader understanding of what the community needs are because each one of these organizations focuses on something a little bit differently and may have better connections here and focus on you know this social determinative health or this community need or what have you. Um, the last kind of didactic thing that I'll throw at you is that, as Julia had mentioned, I have a background in planetary health, and although I work in climate change and climate adaptation, it's important to remember that climate change is just a sliver of the concerns that we're facing as humans. And so climate change interacts with these different environmental changes, but it's not the sole cause of all the things that we're seeing. And even if we were to address climate change, we'd still be dealing with a lot of these other environmental changes and that. And so this is the diagram from the Planetary Health Alliance, one of the leaders in planetary health, which show the underlying drivers of the changes that we're seeing, how these impact environmental changes, which lead to proximate causes. Some of these we talked about already as it relates to climate change. These then travel through modifying factors, which can either alleviate or exacerbate those proximate causes. And then that leads to the health impacts. And again, a lot of what we've already talked about, but again, multiple different factors that can lead to this, and then it's not just climate change. And if I were to make one comment on this diagram, it would be that I wouldn't make it linear. I would make it circular because these health impacts end up leading to, these health impacts end up driving the underlying drivers, right? Because we're just trying to stay healthy, but depending on how we are currently healthy drives our culture, our values, our behaviors, our consumption patterns, population size, the technologies that we use, things like that. So that's my only comment on that. Okay, I wanted to share a few things. These are just tools that I have. These are all related to vulnerabilities. So we have the National Climate Assessment. All these links currently work. I will note that these are all but one are federal links, and so there's no guarantees that tomorrow they'll still be working. But as of now, they still work, and these are still good resources to find. Some of them are archived, some of them are living in other areas because as the federal landscape changes, scientists and other folks are grabbing this information and making sure that it stays alive in some capacity. But anyway, so these different indices and tools to help to identify vulnerabilities in communities. In terms of what MCAP has to offer from a program perspective, we have regional climate summaries, which are across the state divvied out, so you can get a regional understanding of what's been observed in your area, what's projected to change, and how this impacts the communities and different sectors that we have expertise in on the team. Um, I'd mentioned the MinClimate tool, which stands for the Minnesota Climate Mapping and Analysis Tool. This shows hyper-localized climate projections. These are the some of the maps that I showed you, like the uh, um, pixelation on that, I guess if you want to call it, the clearness of that is because of the MinClimate tool. So where most models use 60 by 60 mile grids, we're able to use 2.5 mile by 2.5 mile grids across the state, and so you can get that information in your neighborhood, in your city, in your county. And we have it over 3 future time periods, 3 emission scenarios, and multiple different variables. The link here in yellow, or the link in yellow is for that, but the slides will be shared with you as well. When it comes to identifying solutions, I put these two up there. There are many. I really like Project Drawdown because this is based on climate mitigation strategies, but they also have identified the adaptation benefits, and they've started to look at the health benefits of all these different strategies. So that's a good one there. Some of them are, I think they range from, high cost to low cost and no cost solutions that can be implemented in any area. And then I also posted the Sustainable Development Goals, only because well, not only, but they offer different goals that the UN is looking at addressing by 2030, but also they can be goals within your resilience hub or your resilience hub networks as you're starting to think about what are we really good at? What can we address? What strengths do we have that we can leverage? And what does this organization have? And by addressing two of those, that's better than one place trying to do all of the things. And so starting to map out that network maybe in relation to sustainable development goals. We also have our Community Climate Leaders Program. This is for community members who are interested in taking climate action. These can be people that have already been working in climate and feel stuck, or are just getting their foot in the door and wanting to know where to go and what to do. So this is something that we have, and again, kind of the way that I envision resilience hubs through MCAP's perspective is that these can be the places for other institutions like the university to send programming and education and training through to really reach into those communities instead of doing maybe more state level impact work, really getting into the communities and helping to almost train the trainer approach, continue the movement both through leadership from the institutional level, but also from that community and individual level. And then I believe this is my last slide, so thank you for bearing with me. Just talking about the Corsi-Rosenthal boxes and those do-it-yourself air purifiers. These are some of the events that we've held across the Twin Cities at the resilience hubs that we're working at to get not only get these to get this equipment into the homes of these folks in the community members who need it most, but also get them the hands-on the tangible work with building their own air purifiers. And so the one up in the right is through Liberty Community Church. And we worked with their youth scholarship program. And then those scholars are going to go out into the community and build and host events for their community to build these Corsi-Rosenthal boxes and get them further into the community. But it also shows that leadership and empowerment piece. So these are just some of the other strategies that you can do. And there are grants available through the Corsi-Rosenthal Foundation for the supplies of these. They don't have the capacity piece, but that's where MCAP can help, or MNIPL can help, or local public health departments can help to get the education and curriculum behind this to make the program for you and your communities and your resilience hubs. Okay, I talked a lot. I thank you. And I see there are 32 chats. I hope they're not all questions, but if they are, great. I will stop sharing and open us back up to the larger picture.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Kent, for just an absolute wealth of information. Folks, we're going to have this slideshow available on the MNIPL CCRN YouTube set of resources, and we will also send anybody who registered for the presentation the slides. So thank you, thank you. So the next thing we were hoping to do is to give you all an opportunity. We only have just a few precious minutes. So if you have questions specifically for Kent, if you would write them in the chat, and then Kent, if you would watch for those questions and answer them in the chat, that would be excellent. We were thinking about having some breakout rooms in order to give you all a chance to talk about, I want you to imagine for a minute, what would it look like to take some piece of Kent's presentation, and to put it to work in the institutions that you work for and around. So, for example, Amy, you have a beautiful resilience hub at Our Saviors. You already have incredible programs. You're doing work on solar and geothermal and doing all of the things. What from this presentation could you actually take and bring to life in your place? I don't know if you'd be willing to even just come off of mute and
Sure.
tell us.
Yep. So thank you very much for that thorough presentation, Kent. And I do look forward to going over the slides. And I'm also a representative of my green team, challenged with trying to tell them what you talked about. So anyway, thanks again. And I'll be using the slides. So we find ourselves trying to do cutting edge stuff, and we're encountering builders, the actual people who are going to do that, who raise all kinds of limitations. And obviously we listen to them, but it seems like we need to, we really want to know what we can do related to properly changing our heating cooling system. We're trying to go geothermal, for instance. And I don't know how much in the weeds you want to get here, but we're told that churches can't do that because of our high use situation at a peak use, that essentially we can't keep up with the air leakage.
Amy,
And
I'm going to stop you
okay,
actually.
very good. That's okay. Too
I'll tell you
detailed.
why, because we're running out of time.
You betcha.
But I want to just pin your question.
Very good.
Because I think for folks who are, this is sort of, you've perfectly set me up for my next invitation.
Good.
What Amy has asked is something that in our community of resilience hubs that are being born right now, 25, 26, we're making it happen. We would love to have we are working hand in hand with Our Saviors to try to answer those questions, and it is not easy. But we have some fantastic experts at the ready who are able to come out to your congregation or your cultural center or your library and do an assessment. And, the answer may not be good news, but it might be. I am wondering, though, just from the context of Kent's presentation for a second, if our goal is to bring, I love your example of the boxes, the workshops where you bring, equipment and people can put together these boxes, and then they've got this really effective way of filtering out air pollution. Is this something that you could imagine hosting one of these workshops in your place of worship or your community center? Could you imagine, bringing tools for teaching people how to understand air quality by having workshops on, looking at, how on your phone you can learn about the AQI? You know, are we teaching, are there programs that you could be running that would help prepare people to be healthier, and that would lend this community response to this, broader problem? I don't necessarily need an answer right now, but I think, that's my hope, is that you can take this presentation, maybe digest it a little bit and think about, how does this information come alive in the place of that in the community that I am in the process of building. So I'd welcome, we don't have time for full breakouts, so I'd welcome anybody to come off of mute and share with us, what kind of programming can you imagine? And, part of this is we're sending these messages back to Kent and his team. One thing you may have noticed is that MNIPL doesn't believe that we have to invent every wheel. We actually believe that there is an incredible resources out there, and we just need to start asking for them. So Kent, we're signing you up.
Mhm.
Come and do some things. What are those things? And I'll open the floor.
So in the Nokomis East area, what we're doing is we're doing Adopt-A-Drain. I posted in the chat a map that shows potential flooding, residential street flooding. And so within the areas in our neighborhood that are potentially impacted by that flooding, we're trying to get volunteers to do adopt a drain. The thing that's in our control is to make sure that the drains are, going to be clear and operational. It's easy, doesn't take a lot of money. Just one simple thing that we can do.
Beautiful. And I just want to say, I could imagine a big flyer come out. We're going to have donuts and drain painting or whatever. Try to keep the paint separate from the donuts. But, where you actually do a lot of community building, getting to know each other, education about, the impacts of flooding, education about Mississippi River water quality, um,
Right.
artists. What would it take for you? You're already doing these in neighborhoods. What does it take? What are the sort of steps you have to take to make an effective program?
Well, during National Night Out, I printed off the map that Met Council put together, and I showed that specific neighborhood, and I said, "This is what we're facing potentially. Um, can you help us by adopting one of the drains so that we can make sure that if we do get a lot of rain, that rain gets drained away? But not only that, we want to make sure that the water is free from garbage, plastic bottles, um, all kinds of garbage that's around. And it's a pretty compelling message, and people are energized and they want to take action. So,
Beautiful. Absolutely. Giving people specifics. Here's a
right.
map. Here's what we're asking you to do. Steps 1, 2, and 3. You can sign up to be a captain of a storm drain. Um, these are the gifts of planning that we can bring to our communities.
So,
Does
you take Kent's presentation and we start to find ways where we would make it actionable. And we've found a handful of those. So another way is that we're working to plant trees to help fight against the urban heat island effect. Now that takes time,
Mhm.
but you got to get started now, basically, to down the road, hopefully those trees mature and whatnot. So,
Absolutely. Well, listen, we have about just a couple of minutes left in our time together. Um, I want to just pose one more question. This is just for you to think about as you leave this space. Um, some of these things involve, running a workshop on something that is not critically impacting traumatized people today. And so when we think about um, ice raids and um, you know, tornadoes, it's easy to think about how important it is to get people to come out. But it's not always easy to bring people out so that they can learn about storm drains or even to build um, air filters. How do we continue to do this work of building healthy communities, keeping it fun and connective, and at the same time recognize that, yes, we're in the midst of, great stress. And I don't have an answer to that question, but it's something that I think about a lot. How do we, make gingerbread houses at the same time when, um, you know, uh, things are burning? Um, Figuring out how to build and move forward in the context of the world that we live in, and build these positive steps one step at a time. Um, yeah, I invite you all to be sitting in that tension and thinking about really creative, um, culturally appropriate, thoughtful ways to bring some of this information to your communities. I will just end by saying we are interested in signing up anybody who's interested in sort of putting their um, institution on the map as a place that has um, entered the conversation about how to be a resilience hub. We are sort of expanding the definition of resilience hubs to include what we call emerging hubs. So if you're doing some piece of this work, and you want to be on a journey with others to do one more piece next year, call yourself an emerging hub. We'd love to have you in that network. And so Buff, you want to raise your hand there? I just want to say, you can email Buff or myself or Brett, or, reply to this announcement about the webinar, and we will give you a call and connect you into that network. All right, beautiful. Thanks everybody for a great night, and thank you so much, Kent, for bringing your knowledge and all of the resources of your incredible institution to bear.
Yeah, thank you all. Thanks again for having me, and I apologize that I spoke for a long time. I hope it
It
was
was so
worthwhile,
useful.
but
So useful. Thanks so much for being here.